All right, today we're diving into a pretty provocative analysis of global power. We're going to be looking at some recent commentary that asks a really fundamental question. Who is actually in control? So much of our political world is framed around this one debate. Is big government the problem, or is it unchecked corporations? But what if that's the wrong question entirely? The material we're digging in today argues this entire debate is just a distraction, one that's carefully designed to keep us looking the other way. So let's kick things off with part one, the trap. This is where we get into the core argument, that this whole public versus private sector fight isn't just a simple disagreement. It's a false choice, set up to hide where the real power is. You've seen this a million times, right? On one side, you have the public sector. It's always painted as corrupt, slow, inefficient. And on the other side, you've got the private sector, held up as the shiny, efficient, free market solution to everything. But the analysis we're looking at says this is a total misunderstanding of how power actually works. And this quote from the source really just nails it. The argument is that while we're all busy arguing about which side is better, team government or team corporation, we're missing the real story. A powerful fusion of both, working together behind the scenes. Okay, so if the whole public versus private conflict is just a smokescreen, then that begs the real question, doesn't it? What is the actual power structure we should be looking at? Who are these architects of control? And that's what our second section is all about, the architects of control. Here, we're going to pull back the curtain on the group that this source claims is really running the show, far away from the stage where the public-private debate happens. So what is this structure? The source calls it a global public-private partnership. Think of it like this. A group of unelected oligarchs doesn't need to win an election. They just use the existing machinery of the state, the government, as an enabling environment to push their own policies. The lines between corporate power and state power just completely dissolve. A perfect example of this in action, according to the source, is the U.S. Federal Reserve. Now, we're all taught to think of it as a government agency, right? But this analysis claims that it's actually owned and run by the very same commercial banks it's supposed to be regulating, banks like JP Morgan. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. The argument is that it doesn't really matter if you have the public-facing guy from the Fed or the private sector CEO from the big bank. At the end of the day, there's no functional difference. According to this view, the real control structure stays exactly the same, no matter who the front man is. Okay, so we've talked about the who, this alleged global public-private partnership. Now let's get into the how. In part 3, the tools of total surveillance. What are the actual mechanisms this partnership is supposedly building to control things? The end game here is something called total information awareness. Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a dystopian movie for a reason. The goal is incredibly simple and chilling: to completely get rid of privacy by building a system that watches every single person everywhere for everything they do. And don't think for a second this is just about your emails. The scope here is massive. We're talking about monitoring your financial transactions, your biological data, even what you buy at the grocery store. And the justification for this level of surveillance is always the same. It's to prevent X before it happens. Whether X is a crime, a pandemic, or a climate event, the solution is always more surveillance. But you might be thinking, hold on a second. People are fighting this, right? There's a huge public backlash against things like government-controlled digital money, the CBDCs. Well, according to this analysis, that resistance isn't just expected, it's being managed as part of yet another trap. So here's the move, according to this analysis. While everyone is rightly focused on fighting the public, government-run CBDC, the big banks are quietly rolling out their own private versions, things they're calling deposit tokens. And these are being sold to us as the free market alternative, a supposed victory for freedom. But, and this is the absolute kicker, these private alternatives, they're just as programmable, just as surveillable. They have all the same features that people are scared of in a government CBDC. So the victory is an illusion. People are led to accept the very system they were fighting, just with a different logo slapped on the front. Look, a system this big doesn't just happen. You need people to go along with it, or at least not fight back too hard. And that brings us to part 4, manufacturing consent. This section explores the claim that our agreement is being actively and very cleverly engineered. And how do you do that? Well, according to this analysis, one tool stands above all others: fear. Whether it's fear of a virus, a financial meltdown, or some external enemy, that fear is supposedly weaponized and blasted through media operations to make us more compliant. But it gets even deeper. The claim is that this strategy now extends into the independent media space, the very place people go to get away from the mainstream narrative. The alleged goal is to prop up Trojan horse figures who look and sound like they're anti-establishment, but are ultimately playing for the same team.
So, as a case study, the source points to someone like Tucker Carlson, and it highlights a few key things to make its case: alleged funding ties to figures like Peter Thiel, the huge amount of anti-establishment street cred he got after being fired from a major network, and his family history, his father having run a government propaganda agency. These are the dots the source connects to build its argument.
So the endgame here, the whole point of this alleged strategy, is pretty simple. Build an enormous amount of trust with an audience that is rightly skeptical of the mainstream, and then, when the time is right, use that trust to sell them the very things, like programmable money or digital IDs, that they would have rejected from anyone else. So after all that, you're probably asking, is there any way out of this? Well, our final section, Resisting the System, lays out what the source suggests as a path for individuals to start taking back some control. It's basically a 3-step game plan. First, reject the fear. That means unplugging from the 24/7 outrage cycle. Second, think for yourself. Stop taking any one person's word for it and do your own research. And third, build local. Create your own parallel systems for things like food and community, so you're less reliant on the big centralized models being pushed on you. And that really brings us to the final and maybe the most important question of all. The picture painted here is one of massive information warfare. In an environment like that, maybe the single most important skill we can have is figuring out how to tell what's real. How do you find the signal in all that noise? Definitely something we're thinking about.